Well, now that we've covered some of the basics in landscaping for fire protection, we thought you might like to see some of the specific plants. Now, a lot of the research that has been done on fire-resistant plants has been done in California, and so a lot of these plants also are a drought-tolerant type plant, and they're grouped into different areas of fire resistance. Now, we've got several of them located here in our rock garden, and I thought I'd point just a few of them out to you. Now, first, in the first group of plants that are the most fire resistant are, of course, the cacti and the succulents because of their high water content. And one of those plants is the hen and chicks here, which is a very good fire resistant plant. Now, we talk about plants being fire resistant. There isn't really such a thing as a fireproof plant that won't burn, because they'll all burn if the fire gets hot enough. But there are plants that are less likely to burn than others, and that's the cacti and succulents are in that first group. They're the least likely to burn. Now, another one of these over here are the sedum species, and there are several different ones. This is dragon's blood, and this has a nice red color in the fall. Now, if you look at this, this brings up a really major point about landscaping for fire protection. Now, even though this sedum is fire resistant, this has a lot of leaves in it, and you can actually reduce your fire resistance by having a plant such as this with a low ground cover and letting it collect a lot of leaves and twigs, because that's a lot of fuel in there. So you need to keep this cleaned out to keep that resistance there. Another good plant is ice plant, and it's got a very colorful flower to it, and is a very good plant to use in fire resistant landscaping. Well, now that we've covered some of the cacti and succulents, let's move on to another group of plants that will be just a little more likely to burn, but are still good to use for fire resistant landscaping. We'll take a look at some of those. Now, this group of plants are herbaceous plants that generally have a high content of water in their leaves, and that's what helps them to be fire resistant. Now, one of the plants in this group is the gray Sandalina, and it has a very nice silvery gray color. Now, you can also get green Sandalina if you want to landscape with that, and that has a nice mint green color, but this gray works in very well to the landscape. Now, one of the things that you can do to this plant to help it keep its fire resistant is to, ever so often, trim it down every few years so that it grows back with new succulent growth, and you don't develop a lot of woody material in that. That will help it keep its fire resistance. Now, there are also some ground covers that work well for this. Both Vinca major and Vinca minor have large leaves that are have a lot of water in them, and these are good ground covers because they don't provide a lot of fuel for a fire. Again, you do need to keep all of the trash. If there are leaves from deciduous trees overhead that fall into them, you need to keep those out of there. And one of the things that you can do with the Vinca major and Vinca minor is to mow that once a year so that you get all of that undergrowth out of there and keep that in new succulent growth. Ajuga is also another great ground cover for this because it does have all that moisture in its leaves. Well, now let's move on to another group of plants that have a little bit less fire resistant than our first two, but are still good for landscaping for this purpose. And these include English ivy, which is another ground cover that's good if you keep the trash out of it again, and also things like trailing lantana, and one of the plants that we had in our medicinal herb garden this year, the germander. This has a low mounding habit and has very nice dark green leaves and will work very well for landscaping for this purpose. Now, so far, the plants that we've covered, if you've noticed, have all been low growing or ground cover type plants, and you may be wondering if you can even use bushes and trees in your landscape, and you can. There are just some things that you need to think about before choosing plants. Now, the broadleaf evergreens such as hollies and magnolias are less likely to burn than the narrowleaf evergreens such as pines and junipers. And so if you're landscaping closer to your house, use those broadleaf evergreens. Now, as in the case of trees, a deciduous tree is less likely to burn than a conifer because there's less fuel volume, especially here in Oklahoma because the leaves are off the trees, so there isn't that volume there. And there are some trees that are good for this purpose. that also lend a lot of fall color. The Chinese pistache is a good tree for this purpose, as is the ginkgo and the Bradford pear. So these are trees that lose their leaves and they're good for landscaping for this purpose. Now, one thing that we would like to remind you of is, in addition to having these trees, you want to plant them not too close to your house and plant them not too close together so that if they were to catch on fire, they wouldn't catch your home or each other on fire. Also, trees that you would like to stay away from, especially very close to the house, and if you're in a very high fire danger zone, are the conifers such as pines and junipers. These trees have a lot of fuel for a fire, and also there's a lot of oils and pitch in their wood that are very volatile, and so you want to use these with extreme caution. Now, as you can tell, a lot of this is just thinking ahead of time so that you can plan your landscape to prevent some heartache in the future.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.